welcome back to part 7 of Lisbon, Portugal to Copenhagen, Denmark. In part 7, we were supposed to stop in Lerwick, Scotland, but because of high winds, just had to do a drive-by sailing. So Lerwick was out, and it was on to Kirkwall in the Orkney Islands, and then on to Aberdeen, and lastly to South Queensferry, the gateway to Edinburgh. Well, with Lerwick, all I can say is missed it by that much. We were actually within sight of the harbor and had to not dock or even enter the harbor because our captain and the port authority decided it would be unsafe because of high winds in the area. And so, within sight of our goal, we had to leave and head off to our next port after enjoying another day at sea. And so Lerwick became a day at sea, and since we had already worked out and had breakfast in anticipation of docking in Lerwick, it was time to peruse the new version of the Chronicles to see if there was anything new to do throughout the day. Executive Chef Grant and his team put together an interesting pub grub luncheon and dolce vita, and laid out quite a spread. With a lot of traditional offerings like cottage pie and shepherd's pie, hunter's chicken, fish and chips, and even mushy peas. And we frittered away the rest of the afternoon, me with some editing and her with some reading, occasionally glancing out the veranda window at the white-capped seas. Changing for dinner, we went once more to Atlantide for this time some Thai beef with drunken noodles, glazed pork ribs, and an interesting dessert called Mojito Religieuse. And after carousing around a bit, it was time to head to the Venetian Lounge for tonight's show, Casino. More dancing and singing, and featuring a couple of Rat Pack songs along with a lot of James Bond for some reason.
Bright light city, gonna set my soul, gonna set my soul on fire.
And as the sun sank low, it was time to get ready for the next port of call. Kirkwall, Scotland, in the Orkney Islands. Scattered just off the northern tip of Scotland, Kirkwall is the capital of the Orkney Islands, with a population, depending on who you are talking to, of around 7,000 to 10,000. Once docked, we were off on the shuttle to Kirkwall to do a little bit of self-exploring. The Orkney Islands has a long history from the prehistoric to a strong Viking influence and played a fascinating part in World War II. The capital city of Kirkwall is an interesting place and is a conflicting mishmash of drab contemporary shopping areas, alternating with islands of storied old buildings, ruined castles, cathedrals, and interesting, mysterious, and beautiful winding lanes and atmospheric walks. The centerpiece of the city is definitely St. Magnus Cathedral. St. Magnus is Britain's northernmost cathedral and was started in 1137 and took over 300 years to complete. Because it qualifies as a cathedral, Kirkwall qualifies as a city. Right next to the cathedral are the ruins of the Earl's Castle. You can get inside and tour the grounds, however they were closed at the time we were visiting, so we were unable to do that tour. Since things were pretty quiet in Kirkwall, we just took a walk around town, looking over the local shops. This one sells pretty much everything. And I'm pretty sure that should be the Orkney Hotel. Neat little side streets and alleyways were everywhere. But this is what I'm calling sort of the bland business district. Coming full circle, we found the Daily Scoop ice cream parlor, kind of kitty corner from the cathedral, as well as this old place that has supposedly been around since at least the latter 1500s. And by comparison, the town hall is relatively new, built in 1884. We continued our walkabout, perusing the many store window fronts, including this very interesting dental practice / whiskey and cheese and wine store, and walked on until we stumbled across these very neat, tiny little streets where the buildings were obviously old and could have had many uses throughout the years. We continued on, hearing school children, but never seeing any, hearing conversations, but never seeing anyone, until we came to this interesting juncture: School Place, the Strand, and King Street, until stepping back out into, well, the motorized part of town. I'm not much of a fudge guy, but this fudge looked pretty good. And we were still in Scotland, so there was a lot of scotch to be found. And it's hard to dislike a bunch of folks that are still vinyl lovers. Since we had an excursion that afternoon, it was time to go back and check out the waterfront before returning to the ship. We could see our ship, and it certainly looked walkable. However, they didn't want you walking around the dock area without being brought in on the shuttle bus. So after looking over the waterfront for a while, we walked back to that shuttle bus stop and headed back to the Silver Spirit. And after a quick lunch, we were off on a bus once more for our panoramic South Island tour. There are 70 isles and skerries in the Orkney Island chain. We were to go from the capital of Kirkland to the southern island of South Ronaldsay. Our bus rolled past beautiful rolling farmlands before making a stop at Scapa Flow, a natural harbor that has long been used by the British Navy. It was here that a German U-boat sunk the HMS Royal Oak in 1939 at the beginning of World War II. Because of this incident, work was immediately begun on what was called the Churchill Barriers in 1940, and several more ships were scuttled throughout the Orkney Islands as a defensive measure. The Churchill Barriers were built between May 1940 and September 1944 to protect the naval anchorage at Scapa Flow. Since 1945, they have served as road links between the islands. There are 4 causeways linking the Orkney mainland in the north to the island of South Ronaldsay via the island of Burray and 2 smaller islands of Lambholm and Glimpsholm. The road led us to our second stop, which is called the Italian Chapel. This tiny chapel was built by Italian prisoners of war during World War II. It was built from a spare Quonset hut and in bits and pieces of discarded items by the prisoners of war themselves. In fact, much of the Churchill Barriers were built by these POWs. At first, the prisoners refused to work on the barriers that they considered as contributing to the British war effort. They were then told that the barriers were infrastructure improvements to the Orkney Islands and were to connect the southern islands to the mainland. The POWs thought that over and said, well, alrighty then, and went to work willingly. As a reward, they were allowed to build their church. We continued on from the Italian Chapel across the 3 Churchill Barriers, causeways, before making our third stop of the tour on the island of South Ronaldsay in the small, scenic village St. Margaret's Hope. St. Margaret's Hope has a population of around 550, making it the 3rd most populous settlement in the Orkney Islands. It has a couple of hotels and a few shops catering to the locals as well as the tourists that come to town. St. Margaret's Hope is definitely a laid-back sort of place, sort of frozen in time. This neat old structure was right at the edge of town and looked like it had stood there for 100 years or more. I just loved its look of splendid desolation and the whole texture of the thing. Now, with literally a tree growing from it, it is in ruins. However, you can still get a scale for things here. Here is my 5-foot 8-inch wife standing next to the doorway that she towers over. Soon enough, and it was back on the bus and headed back toward the Silver Spirit. Crossing back over those causeways and seeing more interesting sights, such as the remnants of these boats that were scuttled to help protect the Scapa Flow before the Churchill barriers were constructed. Well, how would I rate our panoramic South Isle adventure? Well, it was a Silver Sea included tour, so can't complain about the value there. Accuracy of the tour description was good, other than they had a couple of pictures that inexplicably did not really connect with this tour. But other than that, it seemed pretty accurate. All scheduled stops were made according to the written tour description. The allotted time was fine. Our tour guide was good, knowing when to get in there and say something and when to just let us wander about. There was no food involved, so nothing to rate there. The overall experience was actually very nice. And would I recommend this excursion to a friend? Yes, just know what you're going to see before you get on that bus. This tour was rated with minimal activity involved, and I would have to agree with that. Now, those two mystery pictures seen here, yes, they are part of the Orkney Islands and were shown on the original advertising literature for this excursion on the Silver Sea website. They were not actually part of the description, so I couldn't actually say much, and I was still pretty darn happy with this particular laid-back excursion. But it is one of those things that kind of make you go, And when we returned to the Silver Spirit, we got a nice welcome back home by all of these nice folks. And as soon as we walked up that gangway, we were in the Arts Cafe and ordering up that obligatory hot chocolate. Later that evening, and we changed for dinner and headed once more to Atlantide. Please check out our upcoming complete dining and drink guide that is coming soon. Well, that's all for today. Join us as we hit our next port tomorrow morning, Aberdeen, Scotland. Today we docked in Aberdeen, Scotland. We were welcomed by one lone bagpiper. With close to 220,000 inhabitants, Aberdeen is Scotland's third most populous city. Locally quarried grey granite was used during the 18th and mid-20th centuries for many of Aberdeen's buildings, and hence the nickname, the Granite or the Grey City. But we weren't here for Aberdeen. We were here for the Stonehaven Cliff Walk and Dunatar Castle. So on the bus we went, across rolling countryside and challenging-looking golf courses until we arrived at the castle. To actually get to the castle from the bus stop, it was a short walk of a quarter mile or so. We explored a side path first as we neared the castle for some shots from different angles. And then it was back to the main path and down 180 stairs, and then back up 100 more to get to the castle proper. Of course, that meant on the return trip it was 100 down and 180 up of those same stairs. But that's for later, because we were at the castle, passing through the portcullis, and staggering up what I was hoping was the last set of stairs. they weren't. We started to pass some signage that was both history and possibly legend, because legend has it that William Wallace himself in 1297 invaded the castle through here. But more research says that this postern, or secret passage, was not even built until 300 years later. Oh well, thus fortified with a little history, it was more stairs and higher we climbed, until we finally made it to the castle grounds. Most of the castle is now a set of splendid ruins, and mostly a shell of what it was in the past. There are a couple of surviving buildings that function mostly as storage today, but the rest is just a shell of the former castle. Signage is everywhere telling you what the area you were standing in was used for, everything from lodgings for clan and visitors, to guard towers, kitchens and storage, fireplaces and meeting halls. And overlooks to all sides of the castle, looking over the sea far below. The remains of the buildings you see today were mostly built in the 15th and 16th centuries, but this site has been recognized as a strategic position and has been fortified since at least the 7th century. The first stone castle, a keep, was constructed in 1392 by Sir William Keith. The castle has, as most castles must, a good water source, and this cistern is that water source. There were soldiers' quarters, servants' quarters, and even stables, which left me wondering how in the world would they get horses up here, or for that matter, down again. To see to everybody's spiritual well-being, there was a chapel. Oddly, the original chapel predated even the stone keep and was built around 1276. Having used up our time in the castle, it was time once more to descend those 100 steps and make our way back up the 180 steps to the top of the cliff so we could begin our Stonehaven cliff walk. And so as we slowly crested that last step, we looked back on the fantastical ruins of Dunatar Castle. After all guests were gathered, it was time for the cliff hike. So setting foot to path, we were off. It was a stunning walk past beautiful coastline and coves. Past cliff sides of flowers waving in the breeze, and grain and grass growing in the fields, and wildflowers swaying in the breeze, and of course the castle, always in the background. Our intermediary goal was the war memorial you see perched upon the hill there, And from the War Memorial, we would descend into the city of Stonehaven. Ever closer to the War Memorial we went, with the castle itself receding into the background. With the last stunning cove behind us, it was time to ascend the hill and arrive at the Stonehaven War Memorial. The War Memorial is dedicated to soldiers from the Stonehaven area that fell during both the First World War and the Second. There are over 200 names inscribed on this tablet and the tablets that stand around the inside perimeter of the memorial. Leaving the War Memorial behind, it was time for a relatively easy descent into the city of Stonehaven. Stonehaven has a population of around 11,200. Stonehaven is an interesting small city with beaches, old houses, narrow streets, and an interesting harborside walk filled with whimsical brass sculptures. I named these sculptures whimsical because as you look at them, you start to notice that the pilots, the fishermen, or the occupants of the boats and planes that are depicted here are all sea creatures or animals. Of sculptures culminates with this love dolphin thing. Stepping into town, you find that the city is very busy with both locals and tourists, and interesting shops like How Bizarre, sitting next to the Bar 10 nightclub. There's a nice area behind the city center with a park-like area and a walk along the Coruna River. Sitting just across the street from the Coruna River is the St. James the Great Church, built in 1877. This bench, carved by a local artist, is from one of the sycamore trees that was felled during the flood alleviation project of 2017. Built in 1877, the Stonehaven Town Hall is still used for special events and sits right next to one of the very few remaining 5 and dime stores where almost literally nothing is a nickel or a dime. So after our walkabout of Stonehaven, it was time to get back on that bus and head toward the Silver Spirit. So how was this excursion? Well, value-wise, even though it was $129 per person, we judged the value to be excellent because of Dunatar Castle and the Cliff Walk. The tour description, although inverted from what we actually did, was very good. All scheduled stops were made. The time allotted was good. I would have preferred a little more time at the castle instead of in Stonehaven, but Stonehaven itself was a good stop. Our tour guides on this trip, they were both informative and gave us most of the pertinent information on the bus, never interfering with our actual sightseeing time. There was no food included, so nothing to talk about there. Overall experience, I'd have to say very good. And would I recommend this excursion to a friend? Yes, I would. Please note they say extensive activity, and that is really true. To get to the castle, you walk down 180 stairs and up 100 stairs to get to the castle, and then same on the way back. The cliff hike was mostly flat ground and easy compared to the castle. All in all, this one scored highly on the Smiley meter. Well, back on board the Silver Spirit, and we returned in time for a special poolside party. The culinary and entertainment team had arranged for a champagne and caviar pop-up and pool party. And while I enjoy occasionally caviar and even sometimes champagne, although not often, any excuse for a party is a good one. Instead of changing for dinner as we usually do, we just stayed outside at Spacanopoli for another wonderful pizza. And for dessert, s'mores. And while we had pizza in Spacanopoli, one floor down on the pool deck, the party was still going on. Eventually, though, we did do a sail away. And later that evening at 9:30, we took in a show in the Venetian Lounge featuring headliner Roger Wright, a stellar entertainer and singer.
Hey folks, here's a story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low-down hoochie coocher. She was the roughest, toughest frail, but Minnie had a heart as big as a whale. She hidey, 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 everybody. Hidey, hidey, hidey. Oh, hidey, 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 oh. Heedy, 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 hee. Hidey, 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 oh.
And after the show, it was time for bed and get ready for next day's port in our last in Scotland, South Queensferry. South Queensferry is located on the southern edge of the Firth of Forth and is a captivating and charming Scottish town with a population of around 10,000. The town's skyline is defined by an iconic trio of bridges, the Forth Rail Bridge, the Forth Road Bridge, and the elegant Queensferry crossing, all spanning the Firth of Forth and connecting the cities of South Queensferry and North Queensferry. We had to tender in, and in the morning, all of that was accomplished by the Maid of the Forth, a local ferry. It was on the Maid of the Forth that we got our first look at the Forth Rail Bridge shrouded in mysterious mist. We were greeted as we docked with a smiling person in a kilt and a drummer and bagpiper in full regalia. The weather was cold and blustery and was threatening rain, so we initially bundled up. But apparently, if you are a Scottish local, then it was short sleeves and shorts weather. In talking to the locals, this shrouding of the bridges is a normal occurrence and happens almost every day. But we set our sights on walking into South Queensferry, a short venture along the esplanade of the Firth of Forth, and headed towards the Forth Road Bridge in the distance. The city itself was filled with quirky housing and interesting businesses as we proceeded along one of the main roads, Edinburgh Road. South Queensferry has become somewhat of a tourist destination and holds many pubs, restaurants, and even ice cream parlors. Bakery that looks like it might be something special. In this case, the line to the bakery extended out of the door and down the street and was clearly a case of someone knowing something that we did not. building in town is St. Mary's Episcopal Church, built in the 1450s for the Carmelite Order of Friars, and is still in use today. We pass businesses of all types, including small hotels and pubs that cater to the growing tourist trade. Decided to head back and headed back along the steps of High Street, passing by that bakery again where the line had only grown bigger. Continuing on, we saw old school candy stores, tattoo parlors, a mix of homes and businesses along the High Street steps, and finally skirting the gardens. Pier, where we would catch a tender ride back to the Silver Spirit, we found this neat little shop. Song thought I might look good in a kilt, so we went in to price some. And after checking a few price tags, she decided, well, I wouldn't look that good in a kilt after all. So back to the pier we went to wait in the rain for our tender back to the Silver Spirit. Soon enough it was here, and we boarded and went back to the Silver Spirit for a quick lunch before reboarding the tender and coming back to South Queensferry for our excursion bus for our afternoon trip into Edinburgh. Edinburgh is only 10 miles away from South Queensferry, so it would have been a shame to ignore it, so we booked an afternoon excursion called Edinburgh Highlights. Very quickly we were in Edinburgh, and although I hate doing it, I snapped a few pictures through the bus windows as we were on our way to Edinburgh Castle and the Royal Mile. Now I'll tell you up front, the best part of this excursion was our tour guide, Scott the Scot.
I can't think of any other way of saying it. So, 3:15 is when this coach will be leaving. This gives us more than enough time to go and explore. So, I'm sorry to treat you like children, but what time's this coach leaving? 3:15. Thank you so much, my loves. Shall we get off the coach and go and storm the castle?
Scott the Scot was a very interesting fellow, full of interesting stories, and led us up toward the castle. Well, storm the castle we did. We battled our way upstream like salmon to their spawning grounds, only to pass interesting old buildings, bars, restaurants, to a crossroad where Scott the Scot turned us loose, pointed us toward the castle, and said, "Go there if you like, go that way to traverse the Royal Mile." So we turned toward the castle, still fighting our way upstream, through the crowds and past street entertainers, arriving at the castle only to find out all tickets were sold out, and there would be no entering Edinburgh Castle today for us. So we had to content ourselves with taking a few pictures outside the barriers, and then we fought our way back downstream with the thought of walking the Royal Mile. People only became even bigger until we ran into what would be our final roadblock, a huge gay pride parade. Oh well, we turned around and headed back to a quieter junction and side street and went to explore in that direction. About here, at St. John's Church, it began to rain again, this time in earnest. So, pulling up the hoods of our raincoats, we went back. The this time past 5-star hotels and graffiti. Once more under the castle, and then took another turn down a side street to find what we could find. What we found was shopping, restaurants, and a much quieter area as the rain once more subsided. And we found these pernicious little dive bombers. Well, it was about time, so we wandered back to the bus stop, boarded our bus, not that one, and headed back to the Silver Spirit. So how was the Edinburgh highlights? It was an included excursion, so value was high. The accuracy of the tour description seemed good, although they made a big deal out of the Edinburgh Castle, which by implication I thought we would visit, but we did not. All scheduled stops were made in the end. Was the time allotted enough? Yes, it was. Our tour guide, Scott the Scot, was fantastic. As it turns out, he worked for the BBC as well as being a tour guide and did special interest pieces for them. So he was especially comfortable talking to groups of people and told wonderful stories. And he was such an entertaining fellow, I give him 5 out of 3 stars. No food involved on this tour. I'd have to say the overall experience of this tour was okay. It was made less okay because of the crowds of people. Now, I know no one could foresee that necessarily, but it certainly interrupted our tour or made it a little bit worse. But that's on nobody but us. And would I recommend this excursion to a friend? Well, yes, I would, with a few reservations, as in timing is probably everything if you're visiting downtown Edinburgh. The Silver Spirit was not leaving South Queensferry until 8 o'clock that night. One of the reasons for that is we had a special show, the Scotland Show. I couldn't capture any video, but they did tell us I could take a few stills if I wanted to. So here are a few samples of what we saw and what we heard.
Come along, let us float it up together. Come along, be it fair or stormy weather, with the hills
And after that rousing performance of drums, bagpipes, and Highland flings, we went to La Terraza for dinner once more. Okay, no more cheese. No more cheese? No more cheese. Okay, more cheese. Join us for our dining and drink guide coming soon for more information on La Terraza. And at 8 o'clock, right on the dot, our harbor pilot and tugs were there to escort us down the Firth of Forth to the open sea and for our crossing to Skane, Denmark. But as the ship started moving, we had another night of a chocolate extravaganza. This time out on the pool deck and accompanied by the Silver Spirit singers and the Silver Spirit Trio later in the evening. This was quite the spread, complete with the chocolate sculptures once more. And chocolate this, chocolate that, chocolate everything. Grace, along with executive chef Grant and his pastry chef, told us just how much chocolate we had in front of us.
Tonight we had 50 pounds of milk chocolate, 20 pounds of dark chocolate, and 30 pounds of white chocolate. So I think just a little bit of chocolate tonight, there's a lot for you to keep going. But right now, I think it's time to burn a couple of calories, dance the night away. So please join me in welcoming to the stage your entertainment team with Rock the Boat. The dance floor is open, the chocolate is open. Have a wonderful evening, ladies and gentlemen.
That's it for part 7. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to be kept up to date with new releases as they drop. Check out my much neglected website at tomsmultiinterest.com and stay tuned for part 8 of 8, where we will have another day at sea en route to Skien, Denmark, the city of Skien, and then on to disembarkation in Copenhagen. Stay tuned for separate videos for the dining and drinking guides, ship tour, and more. Safe and happy travels from T's Cruise and Travel Muse.